people were pushed into poverty in the millions, right? Hundreds of millions. Now suddenly there is no growth, right? Economies are shrinking. People are unemployed. So what's happening to all the poor people in this part of the world?
Well, in that context, let's begin with the slightly good news, which is that Asia economies are not shrinking except, say, Japan. What has happened is that the rate of growth has been reduced. China will still grow at about 7% per capita, India about 5 to 6. So these were rates of growth which would be very respectable at any other point in history. So let's put it in that context, that Asia is still growing and will be the fastest growing region in the world. Having said that, there is a great tragedy across Asia of unemployment and of destitution in many cases. China in one day lost as many jobs as the total population of Sri Lanka. So at one level it is not surprising, because the countries that were engaged in trade have been the first losers. Suddenly a crash of orders and huge unemployment. So no one underestimates the horrendous impact on families and people. So the policy question becomes, what do you do? And in many ways I think we are fortunate that Asia learned a great deal of lessons from 1997. It's very interesting that the Asian lessons of 1997 were remembered by Asia but forgotten by the world. So when the crash hit, look at the levels of reserves Asian countries kept as a precaution. So look at how some reforms Asian countries have been very careful about. Very few Asian countries allow free inflow and outflow of capital. China does not allow it, and China has the highest volume of FDI. India isn't fully liberalized on the capital account. So Asian governments have got into the mantra of totally free markets. They have used a balanced approach of a private sector led development and a solid role of the state. So it is important that in that context Asian governments are responding. They are responding in three ways: a major fiscal stimulus as best they can. Second, their banking sectors are not as much as in crisis as what has occurred outside the region. That's a very important feature of Asia, that the governments are not having to tackle a rotten banking system while they do the fiscal stimulus. So in my view, the fiscal stimulus in Asia will have a much more of an impact quite immediately, because you don't have a rotten banking system. So that's one thing that the governments have done, major fiscal stimulus. Now there are some countries which are in big trouble, like Pakistan, who have no room for fiscal expansion. They are in conflict, they are in a mess. However, in the aggregate Asian picture, there are many reasons for hope that this stimulus would work. While we wait for the stimulus to feed through the system, Asian governments to some extent are already doing some measures to protect the poor. One of the most important measures is, of course, employment guarantee schemes.
Well, in India?
Yes, India has done it, but this needs to be expanded, because poor countries don't have employment insurance. And what happens, of course, in a country like Britain, where unemployment has really gone up, there is unemployment insurance. If you're poor and you're without a job, you need governments to help you. And there are several instruments, of which employment, public works as they were called, they are now called employment guarantee schemes. But basically the idea is do some public works which are targeted towards the poor, protect nutrition when you talked about hunger, school feeding programs, protecting nutrition of children because you can't afford to lose the health and minds of young children. So selective protection of public expenditures that are directed to the poor and public works programs stroke employment guarantee.
We all must realize that both India and China, saw these rates of growth after they opened up. I mean, India didn't grow at these rates before Manmohan Singh's original reforms, and China before it started liberalizing. So China and India got the act together and got millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty because of liberalization and global trade. So we mustn't forget that part of the story. Now, you talk about employment guarantees, the insurance, but those are whether in a crisis or otherwise, with billions of people to feed. These are important. But what I'm asking you now is in the very short term, right? To hold people from falling into absolute poverty, holding people from, falling into hunger and absolute desperation. Are there anything, programs that you see are being implemented on the ground right now?
To take your earlier point, Asia embraced globalization. It is a region that did well and really benefited from globalization, probably more than any other region. So that embrace of globalization will not go. We have become traders, we have become global. So this is just a temporary shock to world trade, and Asia will benefit again from the revival of the global economy. So I don't think there is any suggestion that Asia will withdraw. What is likely to happen indeed is increase in regional trade, which is already beginning to happen to some extent. Your second point on what to do to absorb the shock on the poor and the destitute. A poor person has to work. You can't afford not to work. You cannot feed your family. So the immediate responsibility of governments is to make sure that in the immediate short run people have a job. It will not be a high paying job, but that's where historically public works and employment guarantee schemes have worked very well to prevent mass hunger, mass rioting, because this would lead to a political collapse of governments if they do not undertake measures like this.